So, Joel, thank you for meeting me here, being with me today, and for agreeing to this interview. It's lovely to see you. I had to dig around in our archives and find, I think it might be one of the last times I saw you in person, when you spoke at my church in 2008. Can you believe that? I do remember you had a belt with a very big buckle on it for some reason. I don't know why I remember your belt buckle. It was an impressive belt and an impressive talk.
Protruding belly and buckle. Protruding belly and buckle. Yeah.
Isn't it crazy? All those, I mean, that's 13 years ago, isn't it? So, Joel, the reason I asked you here today, like a lot of pastors, church leaders, with everything that's going on in COVID and with issues of race since the death of George Floyd, a lot of us are struggling to know how to engage in this sensibly, not make it worse. And I've been reading posts on Facebook and finding them very helpful. I must admit, I tried to find some people in my church to interview and was not even knowing if that was a good thing to do. I know some churches are doing that, and I had one friend in church say, "Look, I'm comfortable. I'm not sure I want my skin color to be something that I'm effectively being interviewed about." That's certainly what I felt he said, and there was a moment I was sitting there thinking, well, maybe this is a bad idea, and I actually prayed, Joel, if I'm allowed to invoke prayer, and I went, "Lord, do you want me to do an interview with someone?" And I kid you not, you messaged me through LinkedIn 5 minutes later, responding to a message that I'd sent you 9 months ago. And I thought, here we go. Maybe this is the person I'm supposed to talk to. So it's great to have you. So that was an answer to prayer. And so no pressure on this interview at all, Joel.
No, none felt.
No, not at all. So, Joel, for people watching, a lot of people will know who you are, but a lot of guys might not. I've got a thumbnail sketch here. So you came to the UK when you were a kid from Jamaica, is that right? You ended up being a pastor. You ended up being the director of the Afro-Caribbean Evangelical Alliance, and then the director of the Evangelical Alliance UK, the first non-white director of that, and that's when I met you in that role. And then you went off to Micah. Was it Micah Challenge? Was that the name of? Yeah, you've been doing that for 10 years, have you?
Yeah, I did it for 10 years. Yeah.
Great. I mean, so I've given a quick thumbnail sketch there of all these immense things that you've done. I think you have is it a CBE?
Yes.
CBE.
I'm still in shock on that one, but yes, that's right.
Yeah. Did it make any difference when you got the award when you went home?
No, my family didn't bow. They didn't curtsy. It was a huge disappointment. My friends still call me Joel. It's just really let down. No, I think the shared sense of pride and ownership is really important. The interesting thing about the Queen's Award, whatever one makes of the the kind of history or the anachronism of it, some people would think, is that you don't recommend yourself, your friends behind your back put your name in the hat, and then when it comes up, they don't decide which award you receive. So when you receive your award, whatever ranking it turns out to be, then your friends celebrate with you. So there was a real sense that this is something which you have not done to yourself. Others have conferred it upon you. And very often they have conferred this upon you on behalf of other people who worked with you as well. So it always feels like a community achievement rather than, a sort of individual ego trip. So it's a great honor, great honor.
Well, I remember being delighted when I heard that you'd received it. So, Joel, have met you on occasion. You spoke at our church, say 2008, which was a very long time ago now, when it was more of a baby church plant. And I've greatly admired you. And then I've been watching your Facebook as you've been, posting and trying to help us make sense of what's going on. So, for this interview, we're going to do it in two parts. The first bit, I want to just go a bit more into that thumbnail sketch of your story of because you've been unpacking some of that on Facebook, to find out what it's been like for you in the UK as a black man, and all the experiences that you've gone through with your Christian faith, as best as we can in a short interview. And then the other premise for today is like pastor to pastor, is to say to you, could you help me with a few things? I've got some key questions, and these are the sorts of things that I know other church leaders have been talking with me about as they try to navigate this time. So can we go way back in time, and you on an airplane, BOAC airplane back in the day, flew to the UK. How old were you when you emigrated to the UK from Jamaica?
I was 8, and I'm glad you've gone back there, actually, because this is something I haven't consciously reflected on, apart from a one line in one of the Facebook pieces. But that's where the journey began for me in terms of my own self-understanding, age 8, turning up at Heathrow Airport in May 1960. Yeah.
Wow. So what was it like getting, what can you remember your hopes and aspirations and expectations as you got on a plane to come here in 1960?
Not many hopes. A single aspiration, coming to rejoin my mother, who had left Jamaica some 3 or 4 years earlier to arrive in the UK. But I remember it like it was yesterday. It's just seared in my memory. And
wow.
I committed this to a book I wrote many years ago, Lord Make Us One, But Not All the Same, kind of my autobiography, semi-autobiography.
Okay.
And this was a really shocking experience for me. Leaving the familiar, being British, not black. I wasn't black when I arrived here. I was British.
Yeah.
And coming to motherland. So I had a small kids version of the experience or the understanding of what it meant for Britain to be the motherland. I was in school. I knew the words of "I vow to thee, my country, all earthly things above" by heart by the time I came to the UK, age 8. Yeah. I still had the image of the Union Jack in the corner of my classroom.
Yeah.
Really in the forefront of my consciousness about myself. So age 8, a guy coming off a plane, British Overseas Airways Corporation's predecessor of British Airways, was stepping into a brand new world as an unconscious adventurer. I think that's probably the best way I could describe myself.
So you're part of the whole Windrush story, aren't you? Everything that was happening then. Could you just, again, for people listening, just give us I keep using this word, a thumbnail sketch of, what was happening at that time?
And what was happening at that time is post-war, Britain just recovering from the ravages of war, needing to rebuild, having sent out invitations to the Commonwealth communities to say, please come to your mother country, help us rebuild. My mother was on the forefront of that. Came over, worked in the NHS, so she was one of the pioneers of the NHS. And so when I came over at the age of 8, one wasn't conscious of the politics of all of that, but you knew that you were stepping into a very different kind of world. So my consciousness as something different was a very significant part of my experience of being 8 years old in London, northwest London, Kentish Town, where I first arrived. And then schooling was just a mystery, and every day was something of a culture shock, really. Yeah. Because on the one hand, Sunday was the experience of being in a black Pentecostal context, worshipping in a certain way, being affirmed by blackness, having a sense of your culture and your Jamaicanness nurtured on a Sunday. And then for the rest of the week, from Monday morning when you stepped into the playground or the classroom, you were a different species of British. And you knew this. Your hair was different because we had hair back then. Your color was different. Your language and accent was different. Yeah. Your worldview was different. How you received information and
Mm.
and curated information
Mm.
as a young black boy was
Mm.
different. Your sense of minority status was very strong because you
Mm.
may be one of 3 children in primary school. By the
Mm.
time I got to secondary school, I would have been one of 3 or 4 black boys in a school of 1,200 boys in
Mm.
northwest London. And therefore, you were wrestling on a daily basis between
Mm.
the ages of 8 into your teenage years and early adulthood with this issue of identity. Who am I? How do I survive Monday to Friday as a black Cockneyish English kind of guy?
Yeah.
And how do you marry that with being thoroughly West Indian every evening and at weekends? And
Mm.
just flitting in between those worlds
Mm.
was quite a great deal of emotional and cultural gymnastics
Mm.
taking place. And it's very similar for other kids growing up today, having to navigate those worlds.
Yeah. You remind me of David Martin, the sociologist. He just died very recently, and I remember reading some of his work on Pentecostal churches, as he talks about them being islands of social care for people immigrating into the UK from different ethnic groups. And you mentioned the role of the church. So yeah, if I can unpack with you. So when you come to the UK, so the church, you said they were affirming of your blackness in the midst of being here as a minority person surrounded by white people. How was the church a support and help for you through that time?
It was a subconscious thing. It wasn't something we pushed out there on a Sunday. There was never any sense of, we is black and we is here.
Yeah.
There's never any sense of that.
Yeah.
Borrowed a great deal from the culture of white Pentecostalism because our HQ would have been in Cleveland, Tennessee. So there was a subliminal white Pentecostal undercurrent informing our elements of our worship, the nature of songs. The hymns we sung came after the church hymnal, which was written for us in the US. And that was bled into our liturgy, bled into our subconsciousness as black folks. But nonetheless, this was the only space which I would have inhabited as an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 20-year-old worshipper, where I was a majority. That's the thing. And so in the majority, where your Sunday school teacher and your mentor and your fellow musicians and friends and your pastor and your district pastors and your national leaders were all like you, did an incredible work of confirmation of your humanity and affirming you as a valid person. In that context, you learned music, you learned to speak in public, you learned the scriptures, you learned how to preach, you learned how to do social engagement with people outside of your own house. And that was a world in which your Jamaicanness, your blackness, your black Britishness, the fluidity of that emerging identity was reaffirmed, safeguarded, protected from outside hostility. And even when some of those hostilities would come into the congregation, for example, Brother Stewart, the most innocent guy you can think of, being accused of having drugs, or Martel Fagan, one of our musicians who had a green Mini Cooper, had eventually to get rid of his Mini Cooper because the police systematically looked him up and persecuted him because he was black and with a smart car in the 1960s. Just, you weren't allowed to do that kind of thing if you were black. And so when we had those experiences come converging into our worship experience, it was foreign matter which we dealt with and immunized ourselves from through prayer in the first instance, through reconsolidating our identity as people of God. It wasn't something against which we took up arms against a sea of trouble and lobbied or called out racism, because we did not have the benefit of those kind of political apparatus to describe what we were experiencing. There was no such thing as racism. So you dealt with it through the lens of prayer, the experience of mutual affirmation, and through a very, very strong and profound sense that we were God's people. I mean, that was the key thing. We belonged to God.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that stood us in really, really good stead.
Wow. Thank you. So if we go forward a little in your journey, at some point you end up as a pastor. How did you end up becoming a church pastor and minister? And where was that when you began that?
Yeah, well, you know what, Jason, I don't know how I ended up doing anything I've done, if I'm obvious. I kind of wake up and I find myself doing these things over a 40-year period. I think the step before that is that I guess I've always been a slightly unusual creature, even in the context of my own fellowship. So I would have been one of very few young men or women back in the late 60s to early 70s, to late 70s, who would have left the immediate confines of my church in the New Testament Church of God to go somewhere else to study theology. So a really important part of my journey would have been staying on at school, doing 3 A-levels, going to London Bible College, now London School of Theology.
Oh, I knew I liked you. We both have the same alma mater.
There you go, between 72 and 75, meeting up with a whole bunch of other people and discovering that God was far bigger and greater and more multifaceted than I thought he was.
Yeah.
And so you come back with all of that. I would have been nurtured within the church. I would have understood elements of public ministry, having started preaching, if you like, from I was about 19 years old, gone through all the ranks of youth work and so on. And therefore, when in 1985 they were looking for a pastor at a church in East End of London, in Mile End, I wasn't paying enough attention to run. So I was invited to pastor a small church in 1985, which I did till 1995.
Wow. So during that time, what was your, again, very difficult question in a short interview, but what was the transformation from the 1960s through to the 1980s for you as a black man in terms of issues of race and culture and Christian faith? What did you see happen during that time and change?
Central development was one of sorting out who you were. What am I? And I think for me, when I went to London Bible College, this was a massive cultural shock to my system, because I had learned the lingo by the time I went to LST. I knew how to sound roughly like an Englishman. And so I think there was an element of me which felt I was an Englishman with a very deep suntan who was also a Jamaican at weekends. It was that kind of confused. Right. And I had learned how not to be laughed at by not having a strange accent.
Yeah.
But when I got to London Bible College and then had to share a room with other bona fide English guys, I suddenly discovered I really was quite different. That, you know, I was saying asked, not asked, and stuff like that. So they were picked up on small things which differentiated me. And I thought, oh, I need to really have another look at who I really am, because you know, transversing these worlds automatically, you know, like being on autopilot. Now you're Jamaican, now you're British, now you're, you know, that was autopilot for 10 years or more. But London Bible College, where I was locked in with an international audience, and certainly locked in with some English guys, was a revelation. And for me, the turning point was one day when I had a very small collection of books in my very modest library. And within that small collection were two books on blackness. One was called A Peculiar Institution. The other was a book by Stokely Carmichael. And a friend of mine, a white friend of mine, came in my room. He looked at my very small selection of books, picked out these two and put them out and said, "Ah, will the real Joel Edwards step forward?" And I thought, what is he bothered that I'm reading books about black history and slavery? And who does he think I am then? You know.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was a very significant turning point in being comfortable in my own skin in alien territory where I was minority for most of the time.
Wow. So you said you shared a room with two people. So were you in Aldis or one of the corner rooms?
I was in Aldis, correct, in my first year. Necessarily no longer, obviously, but I was in Aldis precisely, yes.
So if you were in one of the corner rooms with two people, we were in the same. I shared, like, that was where I started at LST, in the corner there. Gosh, hallowed ground indeed.
I was in the corner room, yeah.
Yeah, we may have had the same,
amazing.
Same room.
I still bow as whenever I pass by, I bow, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So that gets you all the way through to, so you start off at this church. You were there, you said 10 years? Gets you through to 1995. I was going to say, how do you get from there, Joel, to what you did next?
Well, so I pastored for 10 years. Before I was pastoring, I was a probation officer, which was also a very important ingredient in who I am, really.
Yeah.
So I, having left London Bible College in 1975, went into the probation service for a period of about 10 years altogether. Wow. And that was also quite an interesting part in my formation as a black Christian, because there you came close up to the criminal justice system, its inadequacies, its insipid racism, which even then wasn't as obvious as it might be all these years later. But similarly, one became aware of the urgency of justice and the need for justice to inform our theology far more than it did, even as a black congregation back then. So for a while, without the details, the choreography in my emergence was something like pastor, and then pastor part-time probation, and then I left the probation service to become the General Secretary of the African and Caribbean Evangelical Alliance part-time while being a pastor. And that overlap between pastor and Evangelical Alliance work was about 4 or 5 years. So that would have been somewhere between 89 to 2009. So, sorry, 1992 rather.
Yeah.
So there was an overlap there of those two things. And my time with the African and Evangelical Alliance was also a very, very formative period of moving into a wider world beyond the black church.
Out of interest, were you a contemporary at London School of Theology with Clive Calver? Was that?
I was there a year after Clive, so there were some names still knocking around the corridors when I arrived in 1972. Clive Calver, Lyndon Barring, those names were sort of all over the place.
So during all of that, being a probation officer, pastor, director of the Afro-Caribbean Evangelical Alliance, what direction did you see issues of race going in the UK and in relationship with the church? Where did you see, I guess I'm asking you, where did you see things progress and where did you see things not progress?
Well, what began to happen by the time we hit the middle to late 70s and certainly by the 1980s, issues of race were becoming very prominent. In the mid-90s, you had a thing called the Swan Report, which demonstrated the degree to which the educational processes were stacked against ethnic minorities, in particular the black community, the way people were taught, the way knowledge was received and assimilated and so on. So the Swan Report is one of those very significant watershed moments for the black community. Said, actually, there is a reason why your kids aren't doing as well in school as you thought they should be doing. There was a reason why my sisters, older than me, came to the UK with a higher standard of education than their contemporaries, and then had to work harder to maintain that just because they were black. During those times, the late 70s into 80s, we were having conflicts, let's call them, Notting Hill, so-called riots, the upheavals in Notting Hill. So issues of race and racism were becoming quite prominent. The SUS laws had taken hold of police-community relationships and were going really, really badly wrong. And so what began to happen in the minds of black Christian communities in that period was that we couldn't sit back and allow God to do all the work through our prayers, but we had some responsibilities. So a number of initiatives developed across the black church. And even though we wouldn't have used ideas about racism or systemic racism, we would have recognized by this stage that some things we had to begin to do for ourselves. So the Afro-West Indian Council of Churches grew up in that time to begin to look at some of these socio-political issues. The African and Caribbean Evangelical Alliance, later, which I became involved with, began to look at some of those issues. Supplementary and Saturday schools became very prevalent in a great deal of our churches. I began one in Willesden, where I was before I left to pastor in Mile End. And so there's a lot of self-help development which began in that period, because from way back in the mid to late 70s and certainly accelerating into the 1980s, black Christian communities began to mitigate against racial biases in society, in work, in policing, in national health services, and so on.
And Joel, ultimately, when you get through to being director of the Evangelical Alliance UK, was it near the end of that time? Did you end up involved with the Equality Commission? You ended up involved in something, didn't you?
Yeah. I ended up being involved in something. I think
if you could specify that for me a bit more than just broadly the Equality Commission.
I might just do that. So in 2010, the Equality Act, which was the domestic equivalent of the European instruments of human rights, had within it the provisions of an Equality and Human Rights Commission. And this Equality and Human Rights Commission was a product of the Blair government and chaired by Trevor Phillips. And the purpose of this commission was to consider issues of racial injustice, to be a watchdog, if you like, for industries and institutions who were not complying with the race relations legislation which had gone before it. And therefore, because I was by this point had become very involved in the Evangelical Alliance, which I began as general director in 1997, and was around the media a little bit and sort of generally shooting off my mouth about the place of justice and the role of the church in society. I was invited to be considered as one of the commissioners when it began. And it was a massive, massive honor. And, all credit to the commission. I was not a specialist in human rights, but they felt that a voice like mine needed to be in that space because I would have represented a set of moral and religious values, which although did not necessarily accord with everybody else in the commission, because, we are morally conservative. And in terms of socio-political issues, we're sort of radical and left. But there was a feeling that to have this outsider voice on the inside of the commission and somebody who was black and a church leader would have been a helpful contribution to the discourse about issues of human rights and equalities in the UK. So that's how I found myself in this very, very specialist, high-powered, and very energized commission with some interesting things passing us.
I do remember seeing some things online when you started that role of people protesting your involvement, the kind of thing. How can a Christian possibly be engaged in any conversations for the UK for issues of equality? It must have been a challenging time.
It was a challenging time. It came from secularists. It came from the gay lobby. There was a side, what do they call it, a sort of sideshow debate during one of the Labour Party conferences. This House believes that Joel Edwards should be removed from his place on the Equality Commission. Why? Because I'm a Christian? No, but because of our views on human sexuality, as a prime example. So it had its very, very rocky moments. Within the commission itself, however, I did not receive any antagonism or disrespect or marginalization from any of my colleagues on the commission. I was treated with great respect. I was treated as a colleague. I was honored for whatever I brought to the table. And so there was no sense of being in that room fighting any battles with anyone else on the basis of my Christian faith. So it was very cordial, although very hard work. So it was a privilege to be there. But this was a rocky time for me. I'm not sure that the church actually maximized the opportunity to raise its voice behind the attacks which came in my direction, or to use that conflict, that public conflict, as an opportunity to talk about our presence in society and our right to be there, as still a majority voice on issues of human sexuality. Would have been then still in the majority, but I think maybe my presence there could have been instrumentalized a little bit more by the church, perhaps if we'd been smarter at the time.
Well, thank you, Joel. I mean, to say we've raced through your whole life, and what a rich life I can see in terms of, your experience of coming here as a Jamaican, Black, British, to the UK, the cultural changes that you've lived through, working as a probation officer, pastor, Equality Commission, directors of organisations, engaging with faith across the whole of the UK. What a unique perspective that you've got. So, and did a great disservice to that quick sketch that we made. So this brings me now to the questions I get to ask you. If you can help me, I said I'm asking them pastor to pastor. So on one level, very personal, and I'll, this whole thing I'll be honest with you, Joel, has become difficult with everything that's flared up. Do you say anything, not say anything? What can you ask? What can you not ask? I know that's something I want to talk to you about. My own experience of coming to this point. So I grew up in council estate, as anyone in America would say, public housing. Church saved my life from a family of alcohol and abuse, and went to Stopsley Baptist Church, where Steve Gawk-Roger was, who you'll know, and Andy Hickford back in the day. And, had this amazing salvation experience, changed my life, ended up going to London School of Theology, and, the rest is history. But when I was a kid, when I was growing up, in my primary school, junior school time, I lived almost next door to the mosque that was built in Luton. And my memories of primary school and junior school were there were like 3 white people in my class. All of my friends were Bangladeshi, Pakistani. I've got rich memories of going around their houses as a kid, and the smell of curry and, various deities in the corner of the room and other stuff. So when I went to high school, the other side of town, I remember, I think that was my first sense of whiteness, as in suddenly I was sitting down with several hundred kids who were all white. And I came home and my mum said, I remember her saying, "What was it like?" And I said, "Mum, everyone's white." I remember that sea of whiteness when we all had to sit in the playground. It's one of my earliest memories at 11 of anything, for race beyond just having friends. And then, Joel, the Brixton Riots, when they happened, there were simultaneous ones in Luton. I remember looking out the window and watching cars turned over and set on fire, and getting a clip over the ear from my mum for watching what was happening. And so, that's about as close as I got to any issues of watching things unfold, and you start to become aware of issues of race. But if I fast forward through my limited childhood experiences, I was thinking about when you came and spoke at our church in 2008. So this might seem very naive. One of my memories are you spoke wonderfully and you had this enormous belt buckle. I don't know why your belt buckle stuck in my head, but every single time I think about you coming to my church, I did not once think, wasn't it great we had a black man speak in our church? And I don't know if that's a good thing or if that's naivety on my part when it becomes to aware of issues of race and racism. I've got lots of black doctoral students that I teach. And one of the things they've been helping me to learn is say, Jason, we love you, but when you say you don't see me as a person of color, you're missing something. And I've had my own journey with them. We were actually in Cape Town listening to the grandson of the former president premier of Cape Town, who'd set up apartheid, who had lost all his relationships with his family because he protested against apartheid, and was telling his story, and they had some black pastors there. And there was an amazing moment, Joel, when some of my black students, female students, were talking about their experiences of once there was an environment that they felt safe. It was quite harrowing to hear them start to pour out their stories of their experiences as females and black Caribbean, African-American females as well. And I remember a moment in the room where I was so deeply uncomfortable, and I thought, what am I feeling? And the only way I can describe it is, I thought, that's my whiteness. I can actually palpably sense it in a way I've never sensed before in the face of the vulnerability of these, amazing people. So I guess I'm one of those people who always, likes to not think of himself as racist because of his background, who likes to think of himself as a champion for equality. But with everything that's going on at the minute, I'm starting to think, am I a closet racist? Am I part of some systemic racism in the UK that's happening? And the whole environment that, to be a white man, to even say anything, makes you part of the problem. So I'm just setting the scene there, Joel. No pressure for you, but how I'm feeling is the way things have opened up. And now I'll ask you my questions. Is that okay? How much of what's going on at the minute, Joel, is because of a necessary examination of racism, and how much is because of the hothouse and climate of the lockdown from COVID? Does that question make sense, Joel?
It does. So it's been said in just about every media platform over the past 4 weeks that the COVID experience has contributed to our consciousness of race and difference in a way which has never happened before. We've never all been at the same time compelled to sit and reflect and have time to truly ingest an injustice which has happened before our eyes in broad daylight. It's just never had time like that before. And one suspects that if this had happened in the middle of normality, if you like, there would have been outrage, but nowhere near the same degree. So I think what it's done is given us a moment of deep opportunities for catharsis, for healing, for mutual development, and that's okay. And I don't want a white person who I work with or worship with to see me as black every moment of every day, of every encounter, to approach me with an active consciousness that I am black. Because then what you have done is to I don't know, cover over my humanity and my made in God's imageness with a color scheme or with my culture. You will have promoted my culture and my blackness above my humanity. And I don't want anybody to do that to me. I don't want anyone to do that to me. So there's no crime in having significant moments of culture and cultural indifference, because we're in the same space, getting on as two human beings together. That's fine. If I'm playing double tennis with you, if I'm playing doubles in tennis with you, you're not. I don't want you as my partner to be thinking he's black, he's black, he's black. I want us to be two good players together. That's that's what I want us to be.
Yeah.
But in those instances where difference occurs,
right.
and it becomes evident that something is going on here, that's the point at which I don't want you to disregard my differentness, my blackness, the contribution I have to make, the perspective I have on this issue, which is different from yours. And that's the point at which I don't want you to say subliminally, you're black, I'm white, I'm right, you're wrong. That's when it gets to me. That's when it gets to be a problem. But so it needs to be there as a part of a cultural and psychological and humanity, as we discourse, as we learn together, as we try and forge a better world together and get rid of injustice and deal with the sin of racism. It has to be a part of the scope of dialogue, and home improvements, if you like, but it mustn't be an obstacle. And so I don't think it helps for white folk and white brothers and sisters to feel bad because they didn't think about a black person being black, as opposed to being a sort of kind of a neutral human being. And it's only happened to me once or twice in my entire life. A very good friend who I worked with very closely in the Evangelical Alliance, we were talking about racial differences on one occasion. And this very, very wonderful gentleman said, I don't think of Joel as black. Joel, you don't think of yourself as black, do you? And I said, of course I do. Of course I do. He was absolutely shocked that I would think of myself as black, simply because I didn't walk around the room all the time talking patois and telling black jokes, and because I've learned the language and because I operate within the context of the Evangelical Alliance as someone who brings blackness to it, but understands that culture and works comfortably within it and doesn't behave like a kind of cultural anachronism within that setting. So the fact that I'm at home in a white majority culture and I can communicate and dialogue or even provide leadership outside my own minority status doesn't disabuse me of my color. And I think we run into problems only at that point where my blackness becomes irrelevant to discourse or to progress or to conflict.
Oh, so helpful. Well, if we so another question I've got here then. So that's very helpful for understanding how you feel about that and your colour. If we look the other way, where there is a discourse out there at the moment that white people are automatically complicit, guilty due to their skin colour. There is an inheritance of the sin of racism that they carry, that manifests itself in white guilt and highlighting of that, and a lot of people acting out of that. What do you think of that? And what that's doing to the conversation?
Yeah, it doesn't help white guilt, white fragility, by which white people get nervous to talk about issues of race, or to make a contribution in the debate is singularly unhelpful. And I think sometimes black assertiveness, because we're so angry and with good reason, because we're so fed up and tired and with good reason, because we don't want to have another conversation about the same thing we've been talking about for decades, and with good reason, all of that energy and anger and justified impatience can drive white attitudes into silence. and that's not helpful either.
Mm.
And I have been on, a number of Zoom calls where in the room, the white folks listen to the black folks but have nothing to say. One of the best encounters I've seen in one of the best conversations I've seen so far in this whole debate was hosted by T.D. where he was the black host and all his guests, I think he had 5 guests, were all white Christians from across the world. And he was talking about these issues. So to hear white brothers and sisters expressing their concerns, their lostness, their confusion, yes, where possible, their guilt, was also helpful. And for a black guy, to host that conversation, I thought was very healthy, very therapeutic. So I'd say, let's not do white guilt any more than black guilt. And let's remember that racism is one expression of the fallen condition, which us Christians call sin and sinfulness. We're all guilty of sin. We've all come short of the glory of God. And there is a sense in which I am equally uncomfortable as a black church leader to experience white racism in black churches with white leadership from the States, where institutional racism is just as strong as anything we might meet in the Church of England or elsewhere, where if you're black or Hispanic or a person of color in a Southern-led States Pentecostal outfit, it is extremely unlikely that you will ever in a year of Sundays become the international director or bishop for that movement. Why? Because all the cards are stacked against you. I've learned to accommodate that. That's just as wrong as just as evil. So I wanted to come directly to your question. When we're in the room together, I don't expect a white person in the room to feel guilty about the sins of their forefathers. I don't want any white folks repenting on my shoulder. I don't want any white folks washing my feet. I don't want anybody to hug me and say how much they love me. I just want us to work together as brothers and sisters. And where we find obstacles to human flourishing and where we find racist behavior which stands in the way of the progress of Christians in the local church, let's be honest and deal with it. We should feel guilty about our personal sins. If I have personally wronged you, or you have personally wronged me, let's feel guilty, let's be conscious. But white folks can also be very aware and identify with the systemic sins which has come from white privileged positions. White folks can feel, and rightly so, a sense of continuity between all they have received as white folks over the last 400 years as a part of the legacy of slavery. It doesn't have to be guilt. It just has to be a responsible awareness that we have started in very different places as a result of our heritage. But it's a very, very different thing than crippling, debilitating guilt.
Yeah, man, that is so helpful, Joel. Around this, I'm, watching friends who are trying to talk and not just white fragility and white guilt, but the whole craziness of the world at the minute with cancel culture, virtue signaling, identity politics, just the inability to talk out loud. I mean, one of the things I find quite depressing in the world that we live in, you can't talk out loud about anything anymore. One of the ways to think things through and learn, I'm convinced of, is you have to be inarticulate first to find common ground and learn and change. But we've got these bubbles in which you're hoisted by your petard for the rest of your life on anything that you say, and people just end up in silence. And it feels like a double factor there of that environment plus this issue making people terrified of talking. It was a story I've got.
That's where
Joe, go on, respond.
And that's where I hold the cards. Because as a black person in that room, I have to set you free to speak out. I have to give you permission to get it wrong, or to say something which sounds vaguely racist or just downright ignorant and stupid. And I have to say to you, if you're for me and I'm for you and we're both for justice, then you have the freedom in exploring your feelings and trying to get this sorted You have the freedom in this room, Jason, to get it wrong, and I'm not going to come and beat you up. So you get it wrong, I tell you that's wrong, that's out of order, Jason, and you say, oh man, missed it, sorry, yeah, didn't get that right. What do you mean by that? And we carry on the conversation. And so I have to give you permission to be free to make a mistake, and I think that's got to be a missing element in a lot of the discourse.
Yeah. Wow, good, so helpful. So Joel, moving on, my last few questions here for you. What do you, so for me as a pastor and a church, you know, lots of people in my church are wanting to engage constructively, my church movement are, and what are some good ways that you think we could do that at this cultural moment and time? You've probably managed to highlight a lot of things we should avoid. That's been really helpful. But what can I do with my church? What would be good? What would be good resources? What would be good conversations to have?
You know, I think there are a whole bunch of really helpful things which are already out there. I mean, anybody just want to go down a Google stuff which people like Robert Beckford has written.
I know
Eddie, the Reddies, you know, Richard Reddy, Anthony Reddy, there's very strong sort of voices in terms of a very pronounced and very strong black theology position. And I think they won't be everybody's cup of tea because they're pretty strong guys. And we need that kind of really assertive, very thought through and very theological input in this kind of discourse. And there will be other voices as well. Mark Sturge has written some excellent stuff, a really excellent book about 10 years ago. Look What the Lord Has Done. Joe Aldred has produced some very, very fine materials. Literally going through one of his books now called Thinking Out of the Box. It's very helpful stuff. And if one goes through any of the sort of historic denominations, and you will see, you know, go to their racial justice department and have a look at what they have done. Church of England, Methodist, Baptist, they've been wrestling with these issues for a lot longer than perhaps, you know, newer communities. So I think there's resources there. There's no shortage of stuff. And if one wanted to go even further back, ask the historic questions about the black presence in the UK, there's some good stuff out there as well. Staying Power, written by a guy whose name I've just forgotten. Realities of the history. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there. There's no shortage. And if you needed a list, I'm happy to send the list in to help your congregation and the movement to think this through. I'm thinking about Race, which came out, Ben Lindsay, very recently, which is, you know, really hit everybody's shelves.
I've got that.
A lot of discussions around Ben Lindsay's book, a guy called Azariah Francis Williams is just about to publish a book called Ghost Ship, which is telling his story as an Anglican inside the church. Hilton Owen wrote an excellent book. Can't remember Hilton's title now, God forbid. But that was really trying to raise the discourse within Pioneer and Beyond. A little, about 10 years ago now, the sort of forerunner of Ben Lindsay's book. So there's a lot of stuff. What can we do? I think the starting point has to be honest environments to discuss. Really honest environments. No avoiding issues, no nervousness to talk, no let's be quiet because we are white and let's listen to the black folks say their piece, because that's very often appeasement but not progress. So what are black folks thinking, but also what are white folks thinking? What sort of fears are around for you guys? I need to hear that. And you need to be honest enough to say, you know, our church used to be white. Now it's 80% black. I am still here as a minority. That's now contrary to my experience in the wider society. How do I deal with that? What am I really feeling about being led by a black man? if I have any reservations, if I have any nervousness, how do I express that? There has to be some place to say that. What are my fears about losing my culture? What does it mean to be a Jamaican in an African church? Let's talk about that, because race isn't just about black, white. It's about racial and ethnic distinctions within a given community. So the space to talk about the things which we are worried about is, I think, very therapeutic and very liberating. Then it would be good for each congregation, because I don't think there is a kind of cookie cut approach to this thing. For each congregation to say, let's make a list of the things which we hindrances to truly reflecting diversity.
Yeah.
Let's look at what we sing. Let's talk about pastoral leadership. Why don't we have folks from Asian or Black or communities more prominent? Let's look at the entirety of the national leadership of our church at the very highest level. Where are the Black folks and why? And what shall we do about this? Not as a knee-jerk response, but over the next 5 or 6 years or 10 years. What's our strategy to fix this issue? And I think another starting point, which a lot of churches should really consider seriously, especially if you're in a historic congregation, Anglican or Baptist, where you know there have been reports done about racism and about training and about retention and promotion within the movement. Why don't we go back to the reports which we've written or the books we have read and ask, why have these not been taken up? That would actually be a very good starting point. You know, why haven't we delivered on these recommendations? Why are they still outstanding? That might be a really good starting point. But I think there are all the structural things around us. We see them, and they can become very invisible to us. So we crash at the roundabout. You know how it is. You're coming out into a roundabout and you're looking in your mirror and you didn't see the guy coming on your right, you know. So where are our blind spots? Let's discuss those. And I think it would also be really helpful for local congregations. Whether you think you have a massive problem or not is not the issue. Why not once every 5 years get somebody in to come and talk about diversity, excuse me. Just get somebody in from outside to have a look at us and give us an MOT, just to say, did you notice that? And did you see that? Did you notice that? Here are some ideas you might want to chew on and pray through and act on. God bless you. Goodbye.
Brilliant.
And that, you know, we don't need to wait for the problems to slap us in the face, but we can actually try and anticipate where we might do better rather than wait till it goes terribly wrong. So there's quite a menu of practical things which we can get our heads into and have very focused and deliberate and measurable prayers to work through as well.
So Joel, with all our hopes and aspirations for the church as the redeemed community of God, standing in contrast to what you said before, you know, racism is an outworking of fallenness of human beings and all the other fractures that live in the world. Well, what gives you hope, and where have you over the years seen things that have been beautiful, if I can use that word, in terms of, you know, the opposite of racism, where there's been an antidote, where there's been something better, you know, that sign and foretaste of what's to come in eternity? Does that question make sense?
No, try again. The line dropped a little bit on me.
Yeah, so I'm
asking, have I seen some good models?
What have you seen within your experience as a Christian in the church that gives you hope because you've seen something beautiful and countercultural and anti-racist, you know, that's a taste of what we're going to get in eternity when all these things are resolved?
Yeah, you know, the thing about eternity, nobody can see it or understand it. So how you see it in advance, I'm not quite sure. But one of the things which gives me hope, you know, when I became involved in the African and Caribbean Evangelical Alliance, it was very easy for me to find myself in multiple settings as the only Black person present. It was a very common experience that out of 400 or 500 people in the room, I am the only black guy. And the two communities were really quite separate. And there were good signs of cross-fertilizing in that respect. People like I.O. Smith and Esme Beswick and one or two others in those early days, Melvin Powell from New Testament Assembly, who were beginning to cross over into the white world. And the work of the African and Caribbean Evangelical Alliance was to try and fuse evangelicals together. And then much later, the same kind of things began to happen in the churches together, communities. But what I'm seeing now, which gives me a great deal of hope, is a lot more genuine friendships at senior church leader level and, if you like, sort of mid-church leader level, that people are really and truly beginning to respect and nurture friendships, genuine and sustained and non-pretentious and non-cringy friendships. We're in each other's homes more, in each other's pulpits more, we go on trips together. And I think those things are good, very good. We're beginning to try and handle some of the systemic issues a lot better, some of the stuff which you see between some of the senior church leaders, let me put it that way, and their ability to come together and bring their constituencies together, even at this particular time of tension, is really very highly commendable. What we saw on the streets of our cities across the world, black and white together, I think is a signal of what we must all aspire to at all levels of the church's life. And I'm seeing a greater appetite for that than I've ever known in all of my Christian life. I'm seeing a greater appetite for justice, for rightness to be done. I'm seeing a greater appetite for a meeting of the ideas of holiness and righteousness and justice coming together. And this is being expressed in ways which we would never have imagined. And when we had at the early stages of the lockdown, that musical masterpiece of The Blessing, where you had all of these churches coming together, working on one piece to bless the nation, that moved me very, very, very deeply. There's a lot of hope for us in what is happening, therefore, in the worship music culture. Still some work to be done there. But I think in the worship music culture, there's communism there. And I think that's great. I'm pleased to see black churches taking up Alpha. When it started, I thought, Alpha comes out of a upper middle class church with, pink and salmon colored ceilings. This ain't going to fly in a black church. It's fantastic. That right across the... And it's going both ways. And I think that's gives me great hope for the future.
Awesome. See, Joe, you're helping me think out loud. If I went back to the beginning of what you just shared, the question I probably was asking would be this: where has the church been part of the solution instead of the problem? So that's lovely to hear your perspective on that. Thank you. Last question, and then I'm going to get you to pray for us, if that's all right. With all that opportunity and hope that you have, what's your greatest concern, if you have any, about what this moment could turn into, other than good things? It sounds like there's a great opportunity that you see, but what's the risk in this moment that you see?
There are a number of risks which are lurking around for us, and as it should be, if we're in a truly creative Kairos moment when the lid has come off and we're accelerating change at a pace we have not anticipated. When you get the Confederate flag being taken down in the state of Mississippi, when they haven't even designed a new flag yet, that's incredible. So that's all good. And we shouldn't be afraid of the turmoil and the confusion and the unanswered questions. So all of that is good. But in the middle of all of that, I just think as the church, we need to keep a biblical oriented Pentecostal charismatic thing to say, and I'm not ashamed of saying it. So let's look at the Black Life Matters.
Yeah.
I'm a black guy. Black life matters. I'm unashamed of saying that. But I don't want that to be a new creed of Christian orthodoxy. What matters for us as Christian orthodoxy is everyone is made in God's image. That's our starting point. And I fear that we might lose that starting point because we could be swept away by a populist in a theology of a Christian anthropology, people made in God's image. And we might take the knee, but that's not a new liturgical posture. We take the knee to Jesus, and if we take the knee on our streets as Christians, we do it in support of a just cause, but it doesn't displace or replace our commitment to the uniqueness of Jesus and to the primacy of our mission on the planet. So we don't lose biblical justice in the pursuit of social justice. And I think, we church leaders need to be unafraid of the tumult and the turmoil. We should not distance ourselves from what's going on. But equally, we should skillfully guide our people through a biblical roadmap, which takes us through the upheavals, the excitement, the creativity, the reimagining of our world, and the reimagining of what it means to live in a more just society. And that means a clearer commitment to Scripture, whilst being a part of what's happening in our world.
Wow. What a fantastic place for us to land. Thank you, Joel. As I said, would you pray? Because my church are going to be watching this. My pastor friends, it'll be sent out to them in my tribe and family, and then it'll go out in other places.
Where you are?
Sorry, Joel?
Remind me where you are. Remind me where you are.
Yeah, I'm in Sutton, south side of London.
Sutton. Yeah. Vineyard.
Yeah, that's it. And so if you pray for us and pray that we access all those wonderful things that you just laid out, Joel, pray that on us, that'd be wonderful.
Lord, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to walk with you through this brand new space you brought us into. You brought the world into this new space, and thank you that you've given us this privilege, and through the death of a man, the world has revised its understanding of the urgency of justice, and we thank you for that awakening, that out of evil you seek to bring good. We thank you for the multitude of conversations which has been taking place in Zoom rooms around this nation and across the world. We thank you that churches, the length and breadth of this nation and elsewhere, are asking new and fresh questions about the way forward. We see your hand in this mightily. And we pray that you would give us the grace and the wisdom, the tenacity, the courage, the daring to make really good use of this space you've given to us. Give us honesty, ability. Give us fresh imagination. Anoint us again and baptize us into the work of your Spirit as the church wrestles with these things. We pray for our leaders. Pray for the leaders of Vineyard. We pray that you'll give them incredible wisdom, incredible strength, in the days and the months ahead. Please help us to avoid the debilitating impact of guilt. For guilt, give us awareness and honesty, black and white and Asian and everybody else. And we pray that in our communities of faith, you will help us to be a beacon and a light. Touch the movement of Vineyard right across this nation and the world. And as people absorb not only this recording, but other places they'll go for resources, may you awaken in this movement a greater commitment to your justice and to a better world. And whoever comes across this recording, Lord, we ask that you would add this to their journey, that together as the people of God, we truly, truly would be salt and light. Help us not to follow the crowd, but to be a divine influence in the crowd. And help us, Lord, above all, to allow Jesus to be seen and known. Black, white, Asian, whoever we are, help us to make you known and to make your justice real. We ask it for Jesus' sake. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, Joel, it's been an honor to have you here. Thank you for your wisdom and advice. It's really helped me, and it's going to help our church and help my other pastor friends. So thank you. So bless you, brother, with all that you're attending to.
Bless Jason. Thank you.
All right, Joel.
All right, mate. God bless.